During my research for this book, I came across the phrases peculiar theories and peculiar views. And that's why the title of the book is Ireland's Hope, The Peculiar Theories of James Fintan Lalor. These were expressions that were used at the time by friends of his to refer to his ideas about how the land should be managed in a new Ireland. Who owned the land, how it was held, and by whom, and who should benefit from it. These were the main themes that preoccupied James Fintan Lalor towards the end of his life. But Lalor's vision was broad and took in areas that we in our day might consider a little strange. So in my remarks this afternoon, I'd like to explore with you perhaps the strangest, certainly the most overlooked of those peculiar views. Now, as far as James Fintan Lalor was concerned, Britain had not only conquered Ireland militarily and politically, it had also taken control of the land on which the people depended for life itself. And the Irish were reduced to being nothing more than tenants in their own country. But Lalor was by no means an Anglophobe. He loved English literature and read John Milton's poetry, for instance, and loved Walter Scott's novels. But it wasn't only English culture that he admired. Britain had introduced into Ireland the feudal concept of the monarch as Lord Paramount or effective owner of all the land in the kingdom. The king could grant land to his loyal supporters for as long as they paid allegiance to him. And this allegiance was formalized in a Christian ceremony in which a supporter, or a vassal as he was called, paid homage to his lord or king, and then took a solemn oath of fealty to defend and protect his lord with honour and chivalry. And this created a personal bond between the two men. As long as he fulfilled his oath, the vassal was allowed to use the land granted to him by his lord. And if you think all of these male pronouns are anachronistic, I suppose, they're not. This was all about men at the time. That's why I'm using them. While Lalor liked this concept, he didn't like the idea of the Irish being subject to the British Crown. He preferred allegiance to Ireland as the criterion for holding land. So Lalor's adaptation of the feudal code meant that even the hated landlords could hold on to their land if they pledged allegiance to Ireland. This would apply whether or not they regarded themselves as British or Irish. So he addressed the landlords directly, and he said, "Allegiance to this fair island, it is your title of tenure to the lands you hold, and in right of it you hold them." He then went on in this article to write, "Forever henceforth, the owners of our soil must be Irish." But what did he mean by Irish? He explained in the next sentence, "To all who own land or living in Ireland, Ireland henceforth must be the Queen Island." So in Lalor's mind, Irishness was not simply a matter of owning land or being resident in the country. In his use of expressions such as Fair Island and Queen Island, Lalor was hinting at what he meant by allegiance to Ireland. He wasn't referring merely to a small island on the edge of northern Europe. How could anyone be expected to pledge their allegiance to a piece of land? Lalor felt that even the concept of nation would not arouse the depth of commitment he envisaged. No, Lalor was talking about something quite different. So to put that in context, in Ireland at the time, Unionists and Nationalists alike regarded young Queen Victoria as the official Queen of Ireland. Whatever about Unionists, Lalor was concerned that nationalists were prepared to acknowledge the British Crown's authority over them. For example, at a meeting of Daniel O'Connell's Repeal Association near Abbey Leaks in 1843, the first resolution proposed and passed with what the paper said was unbounded acclamation was an expression of Ireland's, and this is quoted, devotional allegiance to our beloved sovereign, that is, the British monarch. The speaker who followed O'Connell onto the platform, a land activist named William Connor, claimed that no true Irishman would change our loved Victoria for all the stern Republicans in Europe. At the banquet later that evening, attended by Daniel O'Connell, the first toast was raised to the health of the Queen, to which the Assembly responded with cries of, God save the Queen. Likewise, the Young Irelanders supported the British monarchy. John mentioned one of their leaders, Thomas D'Arcy McGee. He cited the Crown of Ireland Act of 1542 to claim that Queen Victoria now reigns over Ireland. This sentiment was echoed even by the radical supporters of John Mitchell. The editor of the Irish Felon, John Martin, wrote that I owe no allegiance except to Ireland and to the English Queen as Queen of Ireland. That's even more personal, because a Tipperary man, Michael Downey, who stood alongside Lalor in this very place up the road there on the green 173 years ago today, was equally firm when he said, no one questions Her Majesty's claim to the Crown of Ireland. Well, James Fintan Lalor did. And he wanted to replace the widespread attachment to the British Crown with a different focus for nationalist allegiance. So in both his private communications with Young Ireland and his published articles in the press, Lalor repeatedly referred to Ireland as a feminine presence. This gets to the heart of what John was talking about earlier. The earliest surviving example of this can be found in the letter to Thomas D'Arcy McGee. In driving home to McGee his point that landed property should become subject to the will of the Irish people, Lalor used a striking image. This is what he wrote. I would make Ireland, in fact, as she is in right, mistress and queen of all those lands. That she is a lady of soft heart and grateful disposition, and may, in reward of allegiance, confer new titles or confirm the old. 2 months later, he employed the same sort of language in another letter to John Mitchell, adding the warning that those landlords who refused to swear allegiance to the silent Queen should cease to be landowners or quit this land. He did not confine references to the Queen to his private correspondence with Young Ireland. In his first article for the Nation newspaper, he reminded landowners that Ireland was their own mother country. In his attempt to persuade them to rethink their traditional loyalties, Lalor urged the landlords to regard what he called the Queen Island as their rightful sovereign. He offered them the prospect of becoming latter-day chivalric knights who would carry her banner into battle. Lalor continued these references in his newspaper articles, depicting Ireland as a poor lady who had been decrowned and who must be restored to her rightful position, with an armed hand if necessary. Let us crown her a queen, Lalor demanded, and then let her do with her lands as a queen may do. Now, Lalor never explained his use of such colourful phrases, or if he did, I never came across them. And to be honest, the record is very, very depleted. But wherever he said about it, if he did say anything about it, it's never been examined by any of the academics who've studied his life. Nothing I came across in my own reading showed any interest by the people who studied Lalor and his life in this aspect of his writings. So who was this queen who had been driven from her throne, and why should anyone pay allegiance to her? Now, Lalor was a well-read man. He was probably familiar with the long tradition in Irish literature of personifying the nation as a woman. For instance, Gaelic poets of the early 17th century often portrayed Ireland as a female ravaged by a predatory neighbour. Other writers drew on pre-Christian mythology to depict the feminine Ireland in a stronger light before the conquest. An example can be found in a popular book of the time called The Spirit of the Nation. Among the many ballads and verses to be found in this book was one entitled Western War Song. And these lines from that poem, I think, are similar to Lalor's sentiments about his island queen. From the rock-guarded mountains, her cradle and throne, she moves in her splendour, she moves not alone. For myriads unsheathing the chain-breaking sword, now hail the bright vision, long vainly adored. In Lalor's own time, the poems of James Fintan Lalor, such as Dark Rosalie, were published in the Nation newspaper. The following lines are taken from Mangan's other poem, A Cry for Ireland, which the Nation published in May 1846. O my grief of all griefs is to see how thy throne is usurped, whilst thyself art in thrall. Who was this dethroned queen that Lalor and these poets were referring to? As I say, there's no documentary evidence in the archives that would help us understand what Lalor actually meant. But we can speculate. I can speculate. I came to history quite late. There are no academics, I don't think, in the room, so I can freely say what I like without fear of censure by the bastions of academia. And that's what I'm going to do with your indulgence. Firstly, I would like to take you back to the ancient history and the mythology of pre-Northern Ireland. And when I was reading about this, I found in one of the books I came across this extract. Ireland takes its Irish language name from Éire, a goddess of the Tuatha De Danann. Éire's human origins are as Éireann, queen of the De Danann, daughter of Fiachna. Éireann was slain by Sergia the Milesian at the Battle of Teltown in 1698 BC. That's nearly 4,000 years ago. According to the scholar T.F. O'Reilly, writing in the 1940s, Éireann was honoured as the Earth Mother who is identified with the land of Ireland. And O'Reilly goes on to state in this article, in early Irish belief, each king of Tara or Ireland, on attaining the kingship, was espoused to the goddess Éireann. In one poem, we find her depicted as a lady wearing a golden crown and seated on a crystal throne, having before her a vat of red liquor, from which she pours a draught into a gold cup, which she hands to each successive king of Ireland. The idea of Ireland as a woman, wedded to her rightful king, persisted all through the centuries, but then, owing to the English invasion, Éire has long been widowed. That's T.F. O'Reilly. So here we have a female and a queen who is first human and then divine. Through her marriage to the king, she provides him with the power to rule the land. But following the Norman invasion, she was widowed, effectively dethroned. We We know only a little about the subjects in which James Fintan Lalor was interested and the books that he read, but he was a highly intelligent, largely self-educated man who devoured whatever reading he could find on any topic that grabbed his attention. So he must have known something about Ireland's ancient myths and legends. He certainly knew the poetry that perpetuated those stories for later generations. He may have been trying to counteract the widespread support in Ireland for a queen who was not herself Irish at all. But when he depicted Ireland as a woman, was he tapping into something deep in Irish consciousness that resonated with him and perhaps also with his audience? Long after his death, Lalor's ideas appealed to new generations of Irish activists and politicians. And John has mentioned these. Michael Davitt was one of them. Patrick Pearse, of course, was another. So too was Eamon de Valera. Thomas O'Neill, who wrote biographies of de Valera and Lalor, argued that Dev based his position on the Anglo-Irish negotiations of 1921 on Lalor's principle of equality between Britain and Ireland. In 1925, during a speech he gave at Bodenstown, de Valera invoked James Fintan Lalor, just as Pearse had done, as an exemplar of Republican ideals for Ireland. When de Valera became president of the Executive Council in 1932, he identified the nationalist aims of his new government with the principles put forward by Lalor. Now, de Valera would never have gone so far as to suggest that the land of Ireland should in some way be placed in public ownership. That possibility had long since been lost. So when Dev praised Lalor, he was probably trying to inject something of his uncompromising spirit into the push for national unity and complete independence from Britain that he, de Valera, aspired to. Now, you might be inclined to dismiss this as empty rhetoric and regard de Valera as one of those later activists, like James Connolly, for instance, who bent Lalor's doctrines into a shape that suited their own agenda. But I think that would be to do an injustice to Eamon de Valera, because his esteem for James Fintan Lalor was, I believe, sincere. In the Free State Ireland of the 1920s and 30s, de Valera lacked the political will and popular support he would have needed to follow Lalor's principles through to their logical conclusion. But the reality was that the land question had been settled under British rule, and de Valera knew there was no going back, even if he had been so inclined. But in another respect, de Valera was able to give expression to Lalor's concept of the Island Queen. And this was in the creation of his new constitution for Ireland. In 1935, when he was drafting the content of the proposed constitution, de Valera decided, and he got his amanuensis, his helper from the civil service, a man named John Hearn, to write this down on a piece of paper. And what John Hearn wrote down was, "The name of the state shall be Éire." And that statement, simple statement, stuck right through to the referendum of 1937, when the Constitution was adopted by the people, and is still there today. The name of the state is Éire. You are probably familiar with the preamble to the Constitution, which has also lasted right through to the present day. It's quite short, so I'll read it, if I may, in full. "In the name of the Most Holy Trinity, from whom is all authority, and to whom, as our final end, all actions, both of men and states, must be referred, we, the people of Éire, humbly acknowledging all our obligations to our divine Lord Jesus Christ, who sustained our fathers through centuries of trial, gratefully remembering the heroic and unremitting struggle to regain the rightful independence of our nation, and seeking to promote the common good with due observance of prudence, justice, and charity, so that the dignity and freedom of the individual may be assured, true social order attained, the unity of our country restored, and concord established with other nations, do hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this Constitution. Now, if we look closely at this preamble, I think there are three distinct elements. First, there is God. Then there is Éire. And thirdly, the people. And when he addressed 5,000 people, and there were 5,000 according to the papers, and we know how the papers tend to underestimate these gatherings, I'm sure it was no different then, 5,000 people apparently turned up on the fair green outside this hall 173 years ago today. And by the way, the weather was a lot less clement than it is today. It was pouring rain apparently, bucketing down. They had no public address system. You can imagine what it was like. And at that assembly, Lalor stood up and addressed the people and put forward the first of a number of resolutions. And this is what the first resolution said: that of natural right, on the grant of God, the soil of Ireland belongs to the people of Ireland. Later on, after the meeting, he spelled this out in more trenchant terms in one of his articles. And this is what he wrote: no man can legitimately claim possession or occupation of any portion of land or any right of property therein, except by grant from the people, at the will of the people, as tenant to the people, and on terms and conditions made or sanctioned by the people. That was Lalor. So the land had been granted by God to the people. They would dispose of it as they saw fit. Their right to do so would be determined by their allegiance to Ireland or Éire. As he wrote in 1848, let us crown her a queen, and then let her do with her lands as a queen may do. Lalor never lived to see that aspiration realised. Yes, a revolution in landholding took place several decades after his death, with thousands of tenant farmers becoming owners of their own property, and later again, the country finally broke free from British rule. But despite all that has happened since James Fintan Lalor addressed the crowds on the green outside, can we honestly say that in 2020, the first resolution passed by that great assembly has been achieved? That the soil of Ireland belongs to the people of Ireland, or in de Valera's words, we the people of Éire. So on that question, I will sit down. Thank you. This very interesting man who'd been largely forgotten, certainly by me anyway, and a lot of other people I spoke to. The more I dug, the more interesting I found his writings, and I also found that not too many writers had bothered to explain what he meant, so I thought that would be an interesting project, and the result is this book.
Just to tell us about his father and his other brother Peter, who made his name in Australia, the famous stockade Eureka in Ballarat, where my sister happens to live, and where I was delighted to be there a few years ago. And tell us, just put us in the picture of that extraordinary family. Yes. Three of them are whom I mentioned. Maybe there are one or two more that I haven't had up yet. Maybe you'll tell us about them.
Can I give you half an answer, Archbishop, because I would defer to a member of the Lalor family for any news about the Australian connection. Pat Lalor was the father, and he was an extraordinary man, extraordinary family. He was known as Honest Pat Lalor. He was a farmer, and a very successful farmer, I think, in the next county, Laois, Queen's County as it was called. And he became an MP, I think, arising from his success as one of the leaders of the anti-tithe movement, which was not very popular because a tithe meant a payment by largely the Catholic population to support a church they didn't really belong to. So he got rid of that and became even more popular than maybe he was before that. He had a large family, 3 of his sons, James Fintan, Richard, his younger brother, and I think Peter was the son who went to Australia and became involved in that amazing revolution called the Eureka Stockade. And I'm talking from memory here. But Richard was an MP and was quite a supporter to James Fintan during the brief time that James Fintan was in the public limelight, but lived a lot longer than he did and became a supporter of Parnell and Stott, and lived well into his 70s, I think. But perhaps Kevin will say more about Peter, and indeed anything else. No? Okay. Does anybody want to add to what I've said about the Lalor family from that neck of the woods? Or have I said enough? I know little about Peter because he went off to Australia and I didn't really look into his life. But he is probably more famous there than any of the members of the family that we know here, like Fintan and Richard. Is that fair enough?
You would be regarded as a person who probably began democracy in Australia because he was an engineer, went out there and he was there as an engineer, but he took part in I suppose, was the protest of the miners. It was a gold rush, and they were mining, and they were getting very little for their labour, and they decided to protest, and they were attacked, and 24 of them were killed, and he lost one of his arms.
Right.
And he's regarded as the person who really started the whole labour movement and the whole rights of workers, and he's also kind of sowed the seeds of democracy. He later became, I suppose, an MP, which we call it today, and head of Parliament and so on. So he was highly regarded, still celebrated in Australia, Peter Lalor. And I was there in 1993, and I was shown the stockade, and certainly they're very proud of him in Ballarat anyway, and I think in Australia generally. So it's an extraordinary family. You mentioned 4 of them there. So it's great that you have made this man, who was forgotten largely, I think. I wouldn't have realised that Paul Pierce was so much influenced by him, and that he still has resonance in most of our constitutions. So that was news to me. So I want to thank John Waters for illuminating us on that, and thanks John for coming here and for having his own individual view of the present and the past, and being so well informed and being so anxious to keep going at a time when people try to silence him. He's not going to be silenced. He's here. As I was said to him there, he's still standing and not standing still. So well done, and congratulations on somebody who took up history late in life, kind of a late vocation to history, coming out of banking and so on. And I admire the fact that you were able to do a BA, an MA, and an MLit from England, and that you're here today proudly launching through John Waters this new book, which I hope will be widely read and appreciated, and it will put James Fintan Lalor in his rightful place in Ireland's history, with still an influence in today, and maybe with a lot to say to the people of today, as John Waters is doing. Thank you. And thank John Waters.